All right. Thank you, Coach, for joining me on here. And if you would introduce yourself and give us a little bit of information about your background in coaching.
Okay. My name is Mike Frogley. Most of my athletes, or all my athletes and coaches, they call me Frog. I coached at the University of Illinois for a number of years, and we had a lot of success and developed some great student athletes, great people, and great athletes at the time. And I got a chance to coach in the Canadian national program at a number of Paralympics, and had a chance to be part of a number of really successful teams as part of the Canadian men's and women's programs as well.
Yeah. So obviously being an athlete of yours when you were coaching at Illinois, and many of the athletes that we had played against during those times, I think many, if they described or talked about Coach Frogley at Illinois, a lot of things we talk about is fundamental skills. And that was kind of a foundation that has obviously been at Illinois even before you were coaching there, was about those fundamental skills. But I want to talk a little bit today about the fundamentals of defense. And like when we talk about fundamentals of defense, what comes to mind for you? And if you could explain a little bit more about it.
So I think that when I think about defense, is a couple things I'll say. One of the things we always really had a focus on defense with all the teams that I played on, and that's because I believe that defense is something that you can be great at every single day. And I think you can be great at it because it really takes three things: effort, intelligence, and teamwork. And those are three things that you control. And so that's where all of the things get rooted in. And that's why we really start with the fundamentals, and we just work on them over and over again. So we reduce the number of errors we make, and we make the level of play that we go to in a highly stressful situation, say a national championship or a gold medal game, to be a high level, because that's where our that's what we've been practicing, a really high level. So that's really where we start, and that's where so many of the teams that I had an opportunity to coach started. And I think that's a large part of why those teams were so successful, and why those athletes were so successful when they went on to other programs and other teams to play, because they were great, sound defensive players, and there's always a place on every team for a player who can play great defense.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like with my former teammates and even players before I played and players after, the common language that was built in made it so that any of us could jump with each other and play defense together. So if you could go a little bit more into that about like when you start with fundamental defensive reads, do we start with the terminology? Do we start with the actions? How do you get started with it?
So I think, again, you start explaining to athletes that it's going to be rooted in effort, intelligence, and teamwork. Effort is really going to be, you play defense all out all the time. And so you learn what your maximal effort is. And we practice that. That's a skill. The second thing is the intelligence. The intelligence piece comes down to those tiny little parts within whatever defensive skill you're working on, whether it's one-on-one defense, whether it's jumping, whether it's helping, whatever it might be. It's breaking down the parts of each of those skills and then executing them, and then knowing which of the skills you're going to use at a particular point in time. And then the third piece, teamwork. Teamwork's about communication. Defense isn't done by yourself. It is always done connected to your teammates. And the great teams are an example of the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. As a collection, they play better than they would as individuals. And so that's the communication piece tied to it. And always keeping in mind that communication is not just sending the message, but it's listening and receiving it, and then also acknowledging that you got the message. So that way we're all on the same page. So it's rooted in that. When I start to coach players now, I'm always really cognizant of what I'll call a defensive progression. And that's really knowing exactly where does defense start for a person who's first getting in a wheelchair and trying to play it, all the way along and up to the point where they're getting ready to play in the Paralympics at the highest level, or something like that.
So when you talk about the defensive progression, if somebody was listening to this and was thinking, I don't necessarily know where I'm at in my defensive progression, what would be some skills that you think that they would need to work on first? And obviously, we know some of the best players in the world constantly work on those first starting defensive drills. Can you give an idea of like some things they could work on?
Absolutely. It's really interesting. I think that a lot of times coaches have a tendency of starting at too high a level
Yeah.
with athletes. What we really want to get them doing is we want to give them the starting point so they can get playing using those skills.
Mhm.
I don't think, and it'd be funny because if you talk to any of the ball players I've had a chance to coach, they'll say I love drills, but
Yeah.
we actually did a lot of live action play
Yeah.
and gameplay to practice our skills. We didn't do the same movement over and over again. We put all of the skills we did in the context of gameplay. And I think that's really, really important is to do that. So that's the first thing I would say
Yeah.
is for coaches starting out, start out, keep it simple and get them practicing defense in live situations. Where I would start and where I start, and I've had a chance to coach literally 6, 7, 8-year-olds getting in a chair for the first time, all the way up to Paralympic athletes.
Sure.
Where I start with a 6, 7, 8-year-old is I make it really simple. I just want them to learn to first call out the name of their check. I want to make sure they know who they're guarding. That sounds like a small thing, but that's the beginning of the communication piece
Yeah.
that we're rooting our defense in. I want them to stay between their check and the basket, wherever that check is. And I don't want any switching or anything like that to begin with. I just want a player to learn how to look around and how to figure out how to go over a teammate, under a teammate, different things like that to stay with their check.
Yeah.
And that between doesn't mean you're right up on them. You're just between.
Yeah.
And that gives them a lot of room to learn how close and how far to be from somebody. And then the last thing, I want them to have their head up,
Yeah.
see the court.
Yeah.
I want them to begin to learn that. So that's literally where I start defense. And we'll do some really, really simple drills. I'll give you an example of one I use a lot. I call it high five the coach. I'll
Yeah.
have a coach sitting underneath the basket in bushes. You're already smiling because
I
you
love it.
already know where I'm going. I'll have a coach sitting underneath the basket, holding their hands up like this for players to come and high five. And the players start in lanes outside, say at the 3-point line. And all you do is the defensive player, all they do is they try to stop the offensive player from high-fiving the coach. And they can do it however they want. They just got to stay between the coach and their check. They know as soon as they're not, they get beat.
Yeah.
They keep their head up because they've got to see where the coach is relative to them. And then we have them practice calling out, I've got Bushy, over and over. And so it becomes a game. Every kid can do it. And what's neat about that is the kids play the game and they get 1 point for getting a high five. And then they switch. What's neat is the game is perpetual. They're constantly each scoring a point, and you just stop the drill whenever you feel you want to stop the drill and the learning's been appropriate.
Yeah.
So it's a game, but it's non-competitive in nature.
Yeah.
But it just practices the skills because you're on the court. So I keep it really simple.
Yeah.
And I might spend a whole year with 6, 7, 8-year-olds, and that's what defense looks like one-on-one for an entire year. I don't move them out of that until they're consistently staying between their check and the basket, and they're calling out their check, and they're keeping their head up. And that's the other piece is taking the time to let the athletes learn a skill.
Yeah.
I got the opportunity, obviously the privilege to coach you for 5 years at U of I. And I think how many times you did one-on-one shadow till we got it dialed in.
Yeah.
Now you could close your eyes and do it in your sleep and teach
Absolutely.
it.
Yeah. Yeah.
From there, what I would go is I would go to the next level of defensive progression. And what I would do is I would teach an athlete, okay, sometimes you've got to retreat. And then what you do is you still run, you still stay between, but you retreat to stay between. Then what you do is you make the offense run into your rear axle.
Yeah.
That's the term I would use. I would say run into the rear axle, run into the rear axle. And then the last thing is staying ready to push.
Yeah.
So always that lean forward, hands ready to push on the top of your wheels. And so now what you've done is you've moved them along. You've given them one more tool, which is retreat, to specifically help them stay between. You said run into your rear axle. That's an easier way of explaining wheel position. Wheel position, as everybody knows, it's such a sort of nebulous gray term. And you've been in enough games, I'm sure, where you've had these kinds of discussions with officials, where you're debating what the term wheel position actually means. So to make it easy for players developing, just say run into the rear axle. To do that, that requires that they turn their chair sideways. So now you've given them a cue that automatically rotates their chair and starts to help them with that concept of wheel position without having to explain it. And then the last one, ready to push. And that's going to link up to the next level that we always talk about. And so again, I would still practice a simple little skill like high five the coach, or a drill like high five the coach. I just add those as your teaching cues. Okay? And you're teaching, some basic principles. The essence of defense is stay between the offense and the basket. That's the essence of it. So you've built that principle in. Now you've advanced it and you moved it along. So you started with just staying between, calling out your check, keeping your head up. Once they did those well, then you've moved on, and now you're going to give them a tool to help them stay between, retreat. So you're building on that whole concept of staying between. You're giving them a very specific cue that's going to lead into wheel position, run into the rear axle. Now they start to rotate their chair. And then the last one, ready to push. You're getting them ready for the next stop. Not just one stop, but the next one. Because now you can say, okay, you're ready to push, retreat, run into the rear axle, ready to push. And now you're beginning to put together successive stops. So once they've got all that, then I actually move them into what you can remember, what we always taught, and that's the 3 R's: retreat, read, and readjust. When we move into those 3 R's, then what we're starting to look at is different ways of retreating. Retreating facing forwards, retreating facing backwards. We're adding in the concept of zero position and always being on one side of an athlete or another side of an athlete with their offensive player, and then closer within a chair length. So we're building on that idea of being between. And now what does between mean? Well, it actually means being on an edge. It actually means being closer. Reading where they're going. So this connects back to why we have our head up. And then lastly, readjusting. And readjusting meaning now we're going to close space and make them run into our rear axle. And then you think about the last thing we always talk about here is after you've readjusted, it's recovering your hands. Recovering your hands, more advanced version of ready to push. And so now we're starting to connect the progression and build off of knowledge they already have and give them more tools on defense. After we did the 3 R's, and it's at that point that I would change the drill potentially, and I would put them in lanes and begin to work on one-on-one shadow. Because that gets them more complex repetitions, and you can begin to open up the space full court, and that's going to connect to something else we could talk about, and that's what do you do with defense? Half court, full court, where's the game going? So the third level that I go to now, I talk about closing space. I talk about not just axle to caster, but axle to front caster, back caster. Wheel position can be in both directions, depending upon where you want to force a player. And that's the third piece. Now you start to think about not just reacting, but forcing a player in certain directions. And that's why we talk about axle to front caster, back caster, and closing space. And we're still using a one-on-one shadow drill. But now we've evolved it, and we've moved our defense from, I'll say, a defensive position to an attacking position. Now we've made our defense attacking by closing space, forcing to a weakness, and being axle to front caster or rear caster, depending upon where you want to force them. And then the fifth level, it becomes highly individualized. And now we start to look at having players analyze their own strengths defensively versus their opponent and what they want to do. If you're a smaller player, you're keeping somebody farther out from a bigger player farther out, so they don't get to be big on you.
Mhm.
If you're a bigger player, yeah, you might sag off a little bit and try to have somebody come in and play in your space down inside the key. And so it becomes really highly individualized as to where a player's gaps are. So that really kind of gives you five simple levels to progress through, and two really simple drills: high five the coach and one-on-one shadow. I'll tell you a little story. It's really funny. I remember one time one of the student athletes from U of I had just
Mhm.
gone to a training camp and came back and told me a story about how they were in a drill and there was a guest coach there. And the guest coach looked at this player without really knowing where they were from and said, you know what, the way you're playing one-on-one shadow, and they were doing one-on-one shadow, you look like you're from the University of Illinois, because it's just unconscious and it's coming second nature.
Yeah.
And that student athlete kind of smiled and chuckled and said, Frog, now I get why every day we did one-on-one shadow.
Yep.
That player went on to make that national team and went on to win a couple of gold medals at the Paralympics. So
Well, and that's got to be
one-on-one shadow had something to do with that.
And that's got to be a great thing as a coach to also, have that, hang your hat on that a little bit too. It's like you've kind of left your mark on that athlete of a skill set that they've built, which is really great.
Well, it's cool, and you're going through this right now. What it is you realize after many years. When I was a younger coach, I didn't really think about this that much, but I realized what it was is over time what we had these great relationships that really allowed us to work together, and together meaning me with the athlete, to help them maximize their potential. And so it was just a really, really neat journey that when athletes and coaches can work together like that, you can see some incredible things happen.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I want to, kind of go through these 5 steps or these 5 levels that you kind of mentioned, because, those that are familiar with the LTAD, or the long-term athlete development plan, these steps have a lot of familiarity with those levels, especially that first one with the 6, 7, 8-year-olds in that kind of fundamental area. I think a lot of our prep coaches that may be listening are thinking about, we do have those kids at a younger level, but we're looking to try to prepare them to get ready to win games. And if you could speak a little bit about defensive build with younger kids and what really is important in developing them, so that it's not about them winning the games, but about them being successful for the long run of the season.
Yeah, so that's a great point. And I've had the opportunity over the last couple of years here, as I stepped away from being a head coach in a national program, I got involved in our community, and that's what I do. I run a little junior wheelchair basketball team here in Whitby, Ontario, and so what we really focus on is those things. That's what I do, and what I'll end up with is, and I'll break it down into a couple of different parts here for a community coach, like myself right now. What I'll do is I'll divide practices up. So we might be doing a high five the coach drill. And on one side, I might have a couple of young kids, and those are their cues, right? Read between, call out your check, keep your head up. On the other side, I might have a couple of kids that are at a slightly higher level. We always have this problem. What do you do with different levels? And so I'll have that group of kids. They'll be doing retreat, running to the rear axle, ready to push. They're both doing the same drill. One group on one side, one group on the other, same coach in the middle, high five the coach, but slightly different cues. That way we can meet the need of those two groups of athletes. And I can do the same thing with retreat, read, readjust. If we're doing the 3 R's, I can split it up into 3 streams and do the same drill. And I think that's one of the things we want to do as community coaches, do that. Second thing I'll say is, when it's a drill like high five the coach, everybody's playing. What the kids want to do, they actually just want to play a game. They're not paying as much attention to the score as we probably think they are. And then the third thing I'll say is when we get into our scrimmage at the end of practice, and I scrimmage at the end of every single practice, I put all kinds of different types of constraints in to make sure that everybody gets touches on the ball and everybody gets an opportunity to be able to execute and play and have fun. But if you watch the kids as they're playing, they focus less on the score. There's always one or two that might, and they focus more on the possession that they're in. And so if they go down and say you're playing for a half hour, what the kids will see is they'll see the couple of really good possessions that they had. And they won't be having one team wheel off the court with their heads down going, oh, darn it all, we lost 4-3.
Yeah.
You know? They come off the court and what they have seen is they've been focusing on are the successful possessions. I think our job as a coach, if we're especially a community coach, but I think this applies right across the board. After they've gone through the practice, there should be a focus on reflection. And that should be a moment where you ask each kid, each athlete, what stood out. And you can do that as a large group reflection. You can have them do it as individuals. But you want them to reflect. And then what you have an opportunity to do as a coach is go up to each athlete afterwards and point out to them something you saw them doing better. So that the last thing that's on their mind when they leave practice is, oh yeah, I had my head up. I was looking around like a bird today. I saw everything. That's all. Yeah. You know, or wow, man, oh man, I made them run into my rear axle over and over. Coach saw me do that. And I think those are probably the three things, right? Splitting your practice so that it's streamed, understanding you design things in the context of a game so they can practice it, and then making sure you take the time to find that positive for them to leave practice with, tied to the act of reflection.
Yeah.
I think those are three big things I'd really emphasize. And I try to keep in mind when I'm coaching, whether it's 6, 7, 8-year-olds or Steve Serio, Pat Anderson, you know, Steph Wheeler, Christina Rip, whoever it might be.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, when you talk about those different areas, especially for the younger kids, I think that there are some coaches or maybe some programs that have multiple coaches and they have kids at different levels. The first thing we want to do is they want to teach as a group and then split the kids up into levels and go, you work over here, you work over there. And for the youngest of kids, it's kind of hard for them to process. Is like, I want to play with my friends. Why do I have to be separate? When there are definitely creative ways of running a defensive drill, but giving different players at different levels cues that might be a little bit more advanced and that they still are doing the same drill. So I think that's really good to make sure coaches are understanding. The other side of it is the reflection side that you talked about, is that you're able to have a moment at the end of practice to reflect and give some positive feedback. But then also giving an opportunity for them to give reflection to each other. And that's something that, you know, we've always done with our practices, and I've pushed even more and more with the guys recently, is that at the end of practices, we talk about shout outs. And does anybody have any shout outs where some athlete can give a shout out to another athlete about, hey, I saw you doing X, Y, Z really well, and that really helped us on it. And not only does it support the building of the teamwork, but it also makes them think outside of themselves and start thinking about their teammates. And it really builds there. And if you start that with the 6, 7, 8-year-olds, by the time they're in their teens, they're really thinking about what's being great for the group.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think we don't do enough of that. We rush through development. And that makes me think of one thing that I think is so important for us as coaches is, and particularly coaches out in the community, is take away the timeline.
Yeah.
We think, oh yeah, this player's got to learn how to shoot by tomorrow, or this player's got to be able to play defense by the end of the month. And no, what we want them to do is we actually want them to play great defense. That could take a week, that could take a year, but let's take the time it takes to allow them to grow and become great defenders. And when we remove that, I think we're a lot more patient. We teach a lot better, and kids focus on becoming great at defense or whatever it is you're teaching, and they worry less about the deadline.
Yeah. Yep. No, that's great. And I think we all personally as coaches have timelines and deadlines in our own head about where we need to be for the next tournament or the next activity that we're doing. But really diving into the development rather than the timeline is huge. I want to challenge you with two different questions here on giving advice to an individual athlete in two different type of roles. One being the athlete that might be a part of an adult program or a program that their practices are really just an hour or two of scrimmage rather than being instructional. And how does somebody get involved in that and still work on their defense? And then the other one is somebody that has to do training by themselves, because we know so much in wheelchair basketball that you don't have access to a big team or even a second athlete teammate a lot of the time. So how do you train when it's just scrimmage, and how do you train by yourself?
If you're out there and you're in a program that just scrimmages,
Yeah.
I think what you do is you fold your cues into your scrimmage.
Mm-hmm.
So we just talked about defense, and let's say you're just starting out and you're in a program that's just starting out and they go out and they just scrimmage.
Yeah.
You can make those your keys. You can say, okay, I'm gonna every other possession. That's how defense works. Every other possession.
Yeah.
You know what? I'm going to work on making sure I stay between my check and the basket today,
Yeah.
calling out my check's name and having my head like a bird, looking around all the time. And that's how you fold your defensive practice into a program that just scrimmages.
Yeah.
So you might sit down and you might either write it down yourself. You might say, today I'm going to, this is what I'm going to work on defense when we're scrimmaging. This is what I'm going to work on passing when we're scrimmaging. This is how I'm going to work on offensive cuts or picks when we're scrimmaging. You might pick 3 areas. I'm big on groups of 3. And then those are the things you work on. And you might write it down for yourself if you need to. You might have a coach work with you and write it down and say, hey, coach, these are the things I'm working on today. When you're on the sideline yelling things out, can you reinforce these things? And so now what you've done is you've created a practice for yourself within the practice that's going to fit within the team.
Yep.
You maybe have brought the coach in to help you because they may not have time. They may be a volunteer coach who doesn't have a lot of time. They're just there to get you playing. They may not know anything about wheelchair basketball, very little.
Yep.
And so now you've handed them a practice and you've made it easier for them to be able to give you reinforcement. You've told them how you want to get better. Coaches always want to work with somebody who wants to get better. And so I think those are things I would do in that scrimmage type situation. And then the last piece is you're doing it in the game situation. So you're already folding it in.
Right.
Now, if you're by yourself,
Yeah.
it's tougher. So now what you have to do is you have to think about, how can I practice some of this by myself? And so what you might do is you might do what I'll call against air drills.
Okay.
And that's kind of what you end up doing. So you might do something like say, okay, I'm going to put a cone underneath the basket. And now you take a ball and you roll it on the ground. And what you do is you stay between the ball and the cone. And the ball is probably going to roll around a little bit. You might bounce it off a wall or something like that to give it a little bit of movement. But then you learn how to control the ball because it's going to have to hit your rear axle, that type of thing. You might be creative in that way. You might visualize, where you imagine a particular player that you're going to be going up against. And now you use those cues on that particular day. You're staying between them, you're calling out their name, and you have your head, looking around like a bird, head on a swivel. And so you might visualize. You might say, "Oh, I'm guarding Bushy. I'm guarding Bushy. I'm guarding him. I'm staying in." And you pretend that he's moving around on the court, and you move around with him, and you practice your skills. So I think there's some different ways you can do it, but you got to get really creative if you don't have a structured practice where you've got certain drills being used all the time. And I think that's one of the things we saw coming out of COVID is how creative we can be. And as we're trying to practice some of these things, and that there is value to doing that. Now, what I would also say is you can't just stay by yourself all the time. And you're going to have to go find somebody to go against and bring a friend, throw them in another chair and teach them how to play. And as they get better, you get better.
Yeah, absolutely. And while you were talking about the group and the individual dynamics, so like the athlete that is in a scrimmage and maybe it's an adult practice and the skill level and the IQ of basketball might be all over the place on there too. You mentioned too, like there may be volunteer staff that are not necessarily coaches that are there helping out with it. For me, video never lies. And if you have your cell phone that obviously has a high quality video camera on it, and you're only focusing on the defensive side, you can always set up your phone on a bleacher somewhere and record one end of the floor and just record the 5-on-5 area of you playing defense. And you get to watch and get feedback on the cues you decided on at the beginning of the practice. And you get to be your own coach and give that kind of feedback. So that would be something I would recommend on the scrimmage side. And then on the individual side, some of the things that we've always done is a similar drill of like a Christmas tree, something like that, where the action involved is very similar to the retreat, read, readjust actions. But it's always been that way, even in a college setting, is imaginary games or doing things that you're imagining yourself being on defense is an awkward thing for athletes to do. They don't want to be by themselves on a court yelling out things and moving in different actions. But if you can drop the nervousness and maybe a little bit of the ego and get into those actions, it's really great for development.
Yeah, Christmas trees came about exactly because of that. Way back when I was a player,
Yeah.
I didn't have somebody to go up against.
Yeah.
When I had to practice late at night, and so I had to figure out how do I practice defense because I wasn't a very good defender, and so that's where Christmas trees came about. So when I started coaching some of the other guys at that time, and they couldn't all come to the gym for the extra work they wanted, Jeff Glassbrenner wanted
Yeah.
to get better on defense because he was getting beat by Troy Sachs and Joey Johnson at the time.
Uh-huh.
And Jeff was just a rookie. And so he came in the gym at 5:30 in the morning and he would do Christmas trees. And when he was doing Christmas trees, what I would do is I would tell him, okay, imagine Joey's trying to beat you right now. Imagine Troy's trying to beat you. Retreat, read, readjust. Retreat, read, readjust. And so, yeah, Christmas trees is another absolutely fantastic drill. And I always love imaginary games. And I know you remember playing those as
Oh yeah.
as an athlete yourself. And I always used to all of the athletes would always bust my chops and frog. It's so embarrassing. I'm wheeling around the court and I'm yelling and screaming. Everybody's looking at me. And I'd be like, yeah, right now you look bad, but I'll tell you what, practice now so you don't look bad when we get into a game and you'll be thanking me for it. And
Yes.
sure enough, I've had a couple of athletes that have come up to me. I won't use names because they'll deny it, but they've come and said, yeah, Frog, I get it. Imaginary games work, and that's helped me become a better defender, but don't tell anybody. So I won't use names, but I'll tell you, I've had a couple.
Okay. Well, it's out there. Just the names aren't. Well, I think something you had mentioned too is about with the Christmas trees. Is that something that you developed and talked about when you were playing / coaching and getting into that first part? And maybe those that are listening and don't really know your experience of you playing as a collegiate athlete and then going into coaching and the levels and the experiences that you've coached on collegiate, national team, and now recently with the youngest of kids. In that arc of you being in wheelchair basketball, what have you seen change in fundamental defense in either the actions on the floor or in the training that you do, that you think the stuff you did when you were in college compared to what you do now? Is it different? Is it just the same? What do you think?
So I think there's a couple of things that stand out for me that have evolved over the years. The first thing I'll say is we understand the breadth of defense now. And we described it in terms of our one-on-one defense, but we understand where the starting point is, how simple and fundamental it is, and how complex and individualized it can become. It was back in the day, it was just the 3 R's: retreat, read, readjust. That was all you did.
Yeah.
And we've significantly evolved that now. Tied to that, we understand much better the role that contact plays in defense, and that not just how you want to make contact, that's actually a skill. It's not just running into somebody. There's how you close space, how you jump, is a very specific skill that that can be taught, and doesn't mean that when you're running into somebody, you're fouling them. We're teaching them how to make chair contact well within the context of the rules of the game and the spirit of the game. And it's a much more physical game as a result. And it's not just chair contact, but also how do we challenge the ball? How do you appropriately reach and attack the ball? And that's a whole nother skill that we add in here. You know, young players are always taught, don't reach, keep your hands on your wheels,
Yeah.
Actually, as we move up, we want to teach them how to contest the ball, how to poke, how to dig, so they can put pressure on the ball without fouling.
Yes.
So we really understand how to take the concept of contact, and that's really evolved. And then different types of position linked to that. I think those pieces, and then the third piece I would say is defense has significantly moved and will continue to move from a half court defense played in a zone, which back in the 90s, the bulk of the teams around the world and club teams across the US, they played a zone defense. At the highest level now, you just don't see zones. And it's because a zone, it's too easy to break a zone down and dismantle it. And not only do you not see zones, but increasingly more and more we're seeing teams understand how to move their defensive concepts and stretch it into the full court. In that gold medal game in the US men against the Japanese men, we saw that transition where they're basically playing defense all over the court.
Yes.
That is the direction that the game is going, both offensively and defensively. You're going to have to be able to take your defensive skills and play them the length of the court, any space, and think about your defensive principles and what does help look like in different spaces? What does jumping look like when you're picking somebody up at half court? Yeah. So I think that's an evolution of the game. And I think that the players and the teams at the highest level that don't evolve to use all of the space and time on the court, I think they will fall behind.
Yeah.
And I think they'll fall behind rapidly.
Yeah. Yeah. I can definitely feel it right now in the collegiate level of the development of shooters being able to shoot with further and further range is now putting more and more pressure on teams that you must start your defense outside the three-point line. And you're now thinking about how do we initiate contact starting at half court and starting to reduce them, because an open three is just seeming like a normal screenshot for a lot of athletes now.
Yeah. And so with that in mind, it's that whole understanding that we don't have lateral movement in wheelchair basketball. And so position is everything. And so the sooner we can gain position, the better off we are. And one of the neatest things to watch, if you get a young group of athletes just starting out playing the game the very first time, and you don't tell them to get back on defense, they immediately pick up their check. Yeah. As soon as they lose possession of the ball or they just score whatever, because they intuitively understand to get right up on whoever they're guarding right away. That gives them the best chance. We've actually, as coaches, made the mistake of coaching that instinct out of them, and I think that there's a lesson to be learned when you see young kids and they just start attacking the ball right away. Maybe we could pause and, as coaches, think about how we can give them the skills to be able to do that better and take advantage of that intuition.
Yeah, and I think it's us as college coaches watching some of the junior programs and the defensive reads as a group that they've been working on. A lot of it is conservative zones because they know, well, the athletes that we're playing against don't have the range, so let's pack it in. One, that's terrible for the development, that they're just not getting the opportunity to have game time skills for that. But two, these junior players are getting better and better shooters. So that is not going to last for very long, being able to just play a zone defense. So building those skills. And I love the idea of not restricting the athlete, but teaching them the skills to play on the edge. And so those ideas of reaching for the ball, you know that the referee is a human being that's going to make a reaction based on what you do. So if you come in with a hand above the head, swiping down, whether you made contact or not, they're probably calling it. But a lot of tip ups of the ball or trying to make contact with the ball while the person that's handling it is dribbling downward, they don't have full control of the ball when it's going to the floor. That's the moment to try to get the touches.
Yeah, it's really interesting when I'm teaching young kids, and all their different skills. The first offensive skill I teach them is a facing cut.
Yeah.
And what they learn from that is the easiest person to cut on is somebody who's stationary.
Uh-huh.
And so if we're as coaches teaching, starting players to play a zone, we're actually setting them up for failure. They're going to get cut on. And it's funny how fast kids learn, like, a facing cut, and the person they want to cut on is somebody who's stationary. And on the other side, defensively, they learn not to be stationary and get caught sitting still.
Yeah.
And so if we teach them how to play zone defense and we build their defensive skills out of that, we actually begin to set them up for failure, to be cut on and scored against. We violate the principles to stay between your check and the basket, the very things we're supposed to be teaching on defense. So we don't even, full well from me, like, we consider zone a 4-letter word.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Well, and with the idea of not playing a zone, since a zone is a comfortable thing to do, and you've got to stretch yourself outside of that, I think once they get the basics and fundamentals down, whatever level they are in, the idea of defensive communication is always something where you hear a lot of coaches' feedback is we got to talk. They need more talk out there. And they just send out that word of talking, we got to talk to each other. Can you elaborate more on what good defensive communication is, and maybe give some examples of some words and cues that we could give to coaches to make defensive communication better?
So the first thing, when we talk about good communication, it's a conversation is what it is. And it's a conversation that can be heard.
Yeah.
So that means if you're going to have your players communicating, they've got to get used to it. It's a skill. And they got to think about it in a couple of different ways. The first one we mentioned already, you got to be able to send a message. You have to be able to listen to it at the other end, and then you have to give some feedback that you've heard that message. So there's really 3 elements. It's not just me spitting out words and yelling them. That's the first thing, and that's a skill that we have to let everybody know. Communication takes there's several parts to it.
Yeah.
And then the second thing I would say is it's the tone of communication.
Yes.
And the tone of communication is incredibly important. And what happens to us from an evolutionary standpoint, on the simplest level, when somebody screams at you, and I mean screams and keeps screaming at you, you go back into the back of your head, you go into fight, flight, and you're feeling communication and you're not processing it. So we have to learn to be able to, one, you can get a person's attention. Like, I could yell "Bush" at the top of my lungs, but I can't keep saying that. I've got to, once I've got your attention, I've got to be able to change my tone. It doesn't mean we're not loud,
right?
But our tone has to change so that a person can go back into that analytical part of their head, the front of their head, and be able to process what you're saying. So if I'm yelling "Bush, jump," or "Bush, jump," and there's a slight difference there. You're like, "What?" And then you hear the jump. You react to the initial yell, but you hear the jump and start to jump. And so tone, I think, is really, really important. And then the third thing I would say, it's incredibly important that players practice this in practice, communicating with each other, because when you get into a game, you want them to be able to sort all the different stuff that's happening and be able to pull out a teammate's voice.
Yes.
And so one of the things that you probably didn't realize when you're a player, but you definitely did afterwards. I would have you work so much on encouraging each other during chair skills, one of our most brutal workouts.
Oh, yeah.
And the reason why I wanted you to do that was because I wanted you to practice that, how you would communicate with each other. And I was okay with you yelling at each other, because over time, what happened is you began to realize that, if Steve was yelling at you or you were yelling at him, you weren't angry with each other. You were actually supporting each other, because over and over you're doing a chair skill and you were yelling at Steve and he realized it was encouragement.
Yes.
So he was used to things coming out of you that were positive, even when it felt negative. And then the other thing is you guys were learning how to sort through all of the noise, because there'd be a lot of people yelling. And you learn to sort through and pick out the, well, your teammate's voice.
Yeah.
And so there were some very practical, real reasons why we would practice communication that way in chair skills that connect them back to what we'd see in a game. And that breaks it down into, so there's 3 elements for coaches.
Yeah, it's great. You know, friends of my coaching development at PGC, Point Guard College, one of the terms that they use is night communication, NITE. And when it came about, when I listened to it at one of the camps, it really connected with me, because I was like, this is exactly what we do all the time. That the N and the I is name and then information. So when you're communicating with somebody, you don't just throw out the information and then the name, because they're not going to connect to it. So name first, then information, then it's tone, and it's either eye contact or it's encouragement, depending on the situation that you're in. And so just you talking about that, about making sure you got the proper tone and having encouragement with that conversation, totally makes sense. And it connected with me for sure.
Yeah. And the thing we don't really understand about tone, and you'll hear people say, well, I don't have time to be nice and stuff like this and intense and that type of thing. What we need to understand is our reaction to tone. It's at an evolutionary level. Like this is about self-preservation. And that's why we sometimes react the way we do when somebody says, stop yelling at me. And we don't hear the message.
Yeah. So I guess the last thing we would talk about before we jump into my little know your coach is what's the future of wheelchair basketball when it comes to defense. We talked a little bit about USA and Japan on there. We know that there's been teams in the past where we go with a couple of bigs and a couple of little class ones, a bunch of tweeners. What do you see as the future of defense and what we're going to be going after, so I can take some notes and be ready for it when it gets there?
I think the future of defense, I'm not going to say it's full court, but what I'm going to say is that you have the ability to control all the space on the court.
Sure.
And so what you're going to see is you're going to see teams identify when they're going to pick up full court. Sometimes they're going to collapse to half court. Sometimes they're going to go back to the 3-point line and back up. So you're going to see a lot more change using all of the space, so that an offense can't just assume you're always going to be at the 3-point line. You're always going to be pressing. You're always going to be at half court. They're going to have to read and adjust because of that. Now think about the type of player that's going to be most successful in that environment. And that's going to be a player that they're not necessarily the fastest sprinter on the court, but they're definitely going to be able to get to a position faster than other players. And that doesn't necessarily mean speed, and it doesn't even necessarily mean quickness. There's a big element of anticipation involved in understanding how there's an open space on the court, and that's the next space the attack is going to, and they need to be ready to get to that space at a different point in time based off of the speed of their matchup. That might be a little bit long and involved, but that's where I think full court, that's where defense is going to go. It's not always full court, but always controlling all of the space on the court. And I mentioned time, that includes during dead balls. I think we're going to increasingly see defense played during dead balls. We used to do that a lot. You remember that back when we were at U of I together? We had started doing that. We called playing in the dead time. And I think we're going to see that more and more. That's going to require the officials to adjust accordingly. They're not going to get a break on the court. They're going to have to pay attention to position during dead balls as well, because that's a time when you have a moment you can get control of position on the court. And it's going to make for some really exciting play too. So I think there's a couple of things that we're going to see from a defensive standpoint like that, where you're going to see the type of player evolve, probably more tweeners. That would make sense. But definitely you're not going to see a player that's just fast. They're going to have to be smart, quick, and then fast. You're going to see players that play the full length of the court, or teams that play and use all the space on the court. And I think we're going to see more dead ball play.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. And thinking about the player, you're talking about not about necessarily fast or quick, but IQ, defensive and basketball IQ is going to be huge, where they can anticipate what's going to happen and get themselves in the right position before it does. And that comes from getting a ton of gameplay in and trying things out and experimenting to know what your limits are. And then watching a lot of film. You know, we as Illinois athletes always joked around about you ruining basketball for us for watching as fans, because every time we watch basketball, we're analyzing the plays and what would happen here and what would you do. But beyond it being a fan of basketball, it was incredible for our development and understanding the game.
Yeah, I can definitely remember a couple of you guys sitting there saying, "Frog, can't we just watch? Why do we have to break everything down in the tiniest detail?" I totally can remember that. But by the same token, now, like, you guys, I'm so proud of all of you, because you're students of the game. Like, you see and identify the tiniest little things all the way up to the macro concepts, and it's really a lot of fun to see how all of you have grown and the contributions you're making now because of that.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. It's time for Know Your Coach. So just a couple of quick rapid fire questions. First one is, what are you reading right now?
Team of Teams.
Okay.
By General McChrystal. It's one of his
Awesome.
latest books, and it reframes our understanding of how we get individuals to and organizations to work together. And I think it's excellent.
Wonderful. What are you listening to right now? Any kind of podcasts, audio stuff?
Very, very poignant stuff. The last couple of days, one of the things I've been watching is, and for some people, this might be a little bit controversial, but Uncomfortable Conversations with a Black Man.
Ah, interesting. Okay.
Really, really profound explanation of how we can really get a better understanding of racism, actually.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. What's the best piece of advice that you've received from a coach or a person that you look up to?
Wow.
Putting you on the spot.
Yeah. Probably the best piece of advice came from a story that I'd heard. Okay. And it was a story I'd been told by Dr. Nugent, one of our, great mentors. And he told me a story about Ed Owen, one of the greatest student athletes in U of I history, one of the greatest wheelchair basketball players ever. He told a story about Ed going into the gym at Huff Hall in Illinois and practicing this new skill. He thought of this new skill overnight. He went in to practice it, see if it would, and develop it. And he refined it at Huff Hall, and it got better and better at it. And his first thought was not, who can I go beat this with? Beat with this skill. His first thought was, who can I go teach this to? And so it's always reminded me, because Ed Owen had a phenomenal impact. It's always reminded me that the greatest value of the knowledge we gain comes when we share it. And so always look to share that knowledge with others. And so that's probably one of the things that, stands out for me all the time is always, whatever I'm learning, the greatest value to what it is not who I can go beat with it right away, but who I can go share and teach it to.
Totally makes sense, because that's what it feels like at Illinois with all of the coaches in the past that we've had there. Is like, it's always been how we have great basketball minds, and how do we get the best out of our athletes? And then how do we share this with the rest of the world so that they can get the best out of their athletes? So makes me proud to be a part of that kind of group and that development. Last thing is, what are you grateful for today?
What am I grateful for? I'm grateful that so many, hopping right on this last one that you just mentioned. Yeah. I'm grateful that so many coaches and people invested in me. Yeah. And I think about, I'll go right to Dr. Nugent. When I came on board as a head coach at U of I, he used to come by and sit in the office and just talk to me and listen to me. But every 2 weeks, when he was a young man of 83, 84 at the time, something like that. And and so many people took the time to invest in me over the years.
Yeah.
And for that, I will always be grateful. And hopefully I'm doing the same, and can, that's my thanks to them. My thank you to them is that I'm giving back in the same way they gave to me. That's what I'm grateful for.
Love it. Well, I'm grateful for you and grateful for the time that you're giving me on this. And I look forward for more conversations we're going to have like this in the future.
Absolutely. Always happy to share. You
Awesome.
take care.
Thanks.